Hello, everybody, and welcome to the Wine with Jimmy channel. Delighted to have you on board. My channel is completely dedicated to the world of wine, covering multiple topics and disciplines. You'll find lots of information here if you are just an avid wine enthusiast or if you are studying the world of wine. My videos follow very closely key text and key syllabus of major wine qualifications and textbooks, so you'll find the information very important, certainly if you are studying the world of wine. We're going to be looking at the fantastic, wonderful continent of Australia, and we're going to be going deep down under to really get stuck into the exceptional wines that could be found in this wonderful country. Now, if you have a comment, maybe you have a question, please do pop it in the comment section below this video. Make sure you click like and subscribe, but please do get in touch with any of your experiences, favorite wines, key places for you, or any questions you may have. So the Australian series, as this is at a diploma level of WSET, it's broken into a 6-series thriller looking at all things to do with Australia. And in this series 1, we're talking about the introduction, which is then split into 7 parts. Parts 1 to 3 are available as free content here on the world of YouTube, but parts 4 through to 7 are only available to those of you who subscribe to my e-learning portal. That's over at www.winewithjimmy.com. Okay, so let's start to talk about the introduction and history of Australia. So we're going to really talk about the founding pioneers of viticulture, grape growing in Australia, and then moving into some key wine estate pioneers going in certainly into the 19th century, and then we'll go through a little bit of later history as well. So we begin at the beginning for viticulture. So Australia's winemaking history stretches back to 1788 when Governor Arthur Phillip brought the first vines to Sydney. And there is a picture of him in all of his regalia as well, looking fairly pensive, looking off to the distance there. The next little part is about James Busby. So in 1833, James Busby, who is considered the father of the Australian wine industry, brought around 650 vine cuttings from Spain and France and introduced those to Australia, as well as places like New Zealand. This is when we have the likes of Syrah and Grenache being introduced for the first time. So we nearly have 200 years of history of those Vitis vinifera vines being in Australia. Now, he was also very important in terms of creating key literature, and his writings include a treatise on the culture of the vine, and that provided really invaluable insights and methodologies for local grape growers. And that establishes a foundation for the scientific grape growing and winemaking in Australia. So not only importing key vines to use practically, but also providing the theory behind it. Then, of course, we have an influx of European settlers following and bringing further vines into the country. Viticulture then will spread across Australia, across all the states that produce wine today. So, for example, New South Wales, Tasmania, South Australia, Victoria, and even as far as Western Australia. Now, in the early years of, say, emerging commercial wine production, Australia actually produced mainly sweet fortified wines. Now, I'm going to talk a lot about phylloxera when I go through the series, certainly talking about vineyard management, but I'm going to mention it here because it gives you an indication of some of these quite exceptional old vines that we can find in Australia. So we know that phylloxera was a very destructive pest and still is today, that stems from North America and is now found around the world. So phylloxera certainly eventually spread to Australia, but there were very quick, strict quarantine regulations which were sort of enacted in most regions, most notably South Australia, which means, in fact, many parts of Australia remain phylloxera free. Not all of it. Phylloxera is found in some parts of, say, New South Wales and Victoria, but we do have some places, certainly South Australia, where it is quarantined. So, as a result, there hasn't been the mass replantation that was needed in Europe and other parts of the world here in Australia. So, therefore, it's home to some of the oldest plantings in the world, and a lot of them on their own roots, including Shiraz, Cabernet Sauvignon, and Grenache. There's a wonderful picture of the grandfather block in Henschke, of course, found in South Australia. So wonderful, gnarly old vines. Now, to some early pioneers. Here we have Penfolds McGill Estate. So potentially Penfolds is Australia's most famous export, but it's certainly one of the most historic producers. It was established in 1854 when Dr. Christopher Penfold and his wife, Mary, planted French vine cuttings, and they brought them from their voyage from England, and they settle on around 500 acres close to Adelaide. Now, he was a doctor, and his services became very much in demand. So Mary takes over the viticulture and winemaking of the state. And this is important because she put her life and soul into it, expanding the business exponentially before passing it on to her daughter, Georgina, in the late 1800s. By 1907, Penfolds had become South Australia's largest winery. Now, since the shift from fortified bottlings to table wines, starting in the 1940s and 1950s, there have only been 4 chief winemakers here. So do go and visit. It's on the outskirts of Adelaide, and it's where you will find out a little bit of history from the 20th century with the picture there of Max Schubert, who made his famed Grange wine in secret before his peers accepted the atypical blend. So quite famous, of course, Penfolds Grange, possibly the most iconic wine from Australia. We now just go a few years later to 1849, and we're talking about Yalumba. Now, we have Samuel Smith, fresh from England and employed as a gardener for one of Barossa's founding families, and starting their own vineyards, of course, at this time in 1849. Now, by 1852, he purchases 80 acres and releases Yalumba's first wine in the following year. In 1894, Smith's grandson, Fred Cayley Smith, who is a horticulturalist, brings cuttings back from his jaunts around the world. And these vines actually still today produce fruit for Yalumba. It's an iconic winery, and the clock tower that you will see was built in 1908 from local Anguston marble. Now, Smith's son, Sidney, died just after its completion. Yalumba was managed until 2015 by Robert Hill Smith, who represents the 5th generation of the family. Today, he actually chairs the company's board. So that's Yalumba for you. 1851, Seppeltsfield. So Joseph and Johanna Seppelt purchased 158 acres in the Barossa in 1850, and they emigrated from Silesia. After an ill-fated tobacco farm in the Adelaide Hills, they decided to move to Barossa, and their focus soon shifted to wines and spirits. In 1867, they built or started planning a blue stone cellar. It would finally be completed about a decade after by his son Benno. And in 1878, Benno began the long tradition of maturing single vintage tawny port for a century before release. The winery is also a wonderful treasure trove for old Australian sherry, also called Apres, and it boasts the country's longest standing wine brand, Para. Now, the tasting room here is today, it's in the former 1900 bottling hall. It's quite contemporary today, but history lovers will definitely ogle over the 1851 Seppelt homestead, the 1877 distillery, and the 1860s blending cellar. They apparently can also taste samples from any year since 1877 in the Centennial cellar. Now we're going across the other side of the country to Tyrrell's wines. The Tyrrell's family tree can be traced to the 11th century when Walter Tyrrell arrived in England with William the Conqueror, no less. And if we fast forward to 1858, when Edward Tyrrell snapped up one of the last available properties in the Hunter Valley, about 2 hours north of Sydney, he founded, of course, the eponymous winery. Tyrrell's infrastructure was built in 1863, and the brand's first vintage was 1864. As you probably are aware, they are most well known today for Semillon, certainly from some very old vine stock. The original slab hut that you'll see in your picture, built in 1858, gives you a lot of interest around the history of the estate. Some beautiful rows of old oak vats stand against the wall, and the walls of corrugated iron. In the tasting room, the portraits of the Tyrrells of yesteryear keep watch as you taste from the beautiful wines they produce. And it's an exceptional estate to go and visit. So that's Tyrrells. Then on to Henschke for our final one. Just to reiterate, please, that this is just one of a few. I'm giving you some of the key early pioneers, but of course there are many others. Now, the Barossa Valley and the neighbouring Eden Valley possess really an embarrassment of riches. Of course, they boast wonderful, ancient old vines, historic stone buildings, and of course, families of huge amounts of history, long entrenched in the area's development. But the Henschkes, with this wonderful picture here, you'll see, the Henschke family claim a 151-year-old lineage that traces to the region's earliest settlers. And that's the likes of Stephen Carl Henschke and his wife Prue, who have been tireless champions here in the region. Stephen took over from his father Cyril in 1979, and the generations of families here extend fivefold. The first commercial wine was produced in 1868, and it was a table wine, not a fortified wine, famous at those times. Now, Henschke's stone winery and tasting room was built in 1860s. They're modest, considering certainly the very iconic standard of Henschke today. These buildings represent the past and present of Henschke, so low ceilings, narrow archways, portraits of family members, open concrete fermenters, and an old basket press. It's a romantic setting, but really it's the Hill of Grace vineyard that really takes you back in time. It was planted as far back as the 1860s. They are gnarly old vines, and they're like sentinels across from a Lutheran church of the same age. It's just fascinating, wonderful, and what a great picture as well here. So moving on a little bit, just to talk about more history. The first exports then of Australian wine were recorded in the 1850s and 60s, as we mentioned from some of those very early pioneers we just went through. But the phylloxera outbreak in Europe is very key. This gave Australia a golden opportunity to export its wines, particularly to the UK. Now, as Europe's vineyards recovered from phylloxera, Australia then had to shift its focus back to its own domestic market, and in particular, the fortified wine produced mainly from the grape variety Muscat Gordo Blanco, which is Muscat of Alexandria, but also Shiraz and Grenache. After World War II, waves of European immigrants and Australian tourists returning from Europe increased the demand for non-fortified dry wines. From the 1950s onwards, many of the companies that the Australian wine scene is now dominated by began their rise to their prominence, including Orlando, which is now today called Jacobs Creek, Lindemans, Hardy's, and Penfolds. There is an Orlando, I believe, an Orlando label right there, Barossa Pearl, and some advertising on the left. The happiest drink for Christmas, as you can see. Now, these companies started to modernize the wine industry due to the revenues they were receiving, pioneering the likes of stainless steel tanks and, of course, temperature control, making commercial outputs. Now, it was not until the second half of the 1980s that Australia, as a wine industry, shifted its focus to the export market. Its generic body that you see the emblem of there on your slide, that's Wine Australia, developed an innovative and completely new approach to marketing wine, embracing very much modern advertising. The Aussies led the way in labelling wine by grape variety and providing taste descriptors on the back of the label. Of course, a very alien practice from Europe. And this really helped consumers understand what exactly was in the bottle and making wine, of course, friendlier and more accessible. The wines are also themselves, to the wine in the bottle, more accessible, more friendly, often with nice ripe fruits and then typical wooded elements like vanilla and coconut. This approach was absolutely hugely successful, and by the early 2000s, Australia had become the world's fifth largest exporter of wine. But it's not always as easy as just success upon success. We do have, from 1990 to the late 2000s, 2008, the vineyard area rapidly increasing from 59,000 hectares to 170,000 hectares. But since then, in the last 15 years or so, the plantings have actually fallen back down towards around 146,000 hectares. You'll see this quite clearly on the left-hand bar chart on your screen. Now, why is this? Giving you a few pointers on the right-hand side. Firstly, there was a huge oversupply. The non-European countries had started to follow the Australian successful model, creating, therefore, increased competition on the export markets and, of course, reducing the demand for inexpensive Australian wine. The situation was then further compounded and made worse by the strength of the Australian dollar, particularly following the financial crisis, the credit crunch of 2008. So this actually made Australian wine more expensive than many of the competitors on the export markets, such as Chile and Argentina. The large producers also had to force down grape prices in order to keep retail prices competitive. But then there were a series of serious droughts. This significantly pushed up the cost of water for irrigation, which is typically essential across many parts of the larger producing parts of Australia. As a result, a considerable number of growers were just simply forced out of business. However, these factors have also led many producers to shift their focus from producing inexpensive, high volume wines to smaller production and higher priced bottlings, really tapping into that premium market. And this has helped to maintain Australia's strong position in the export markets. Okay, well, that brings me to a conclusion for this rather long first video looking at the introduction and history of Australia. Once again, if you have any comments or questions, I would love to hear from you. What do you have to say about those pioneers? Have you tried some of those very exquisite famous wines from Penfolds, Henschke, Seppeltsfield, Tyrrell's, to name a few? Please do get in touch. But until next time, I've been Jimmy Smith. Please do join me for a class, glass, or bottle if you come to the UK. Ciao for now. Goodbye.